Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. We have a guest on who introduced us to this character, this mafia figure that I had never heard of. I don't believe you had ever heard of. And he wrote a book on this truly remarkable individual who played both sides of the law, highly ranked in the mafia, but also he was an informant for the FBI as well. So he was dipping into as many pools as possible. But Tim, let's dip into your emotions. How are you today?
Doing good. Thanks a lot for asking. And we weren't talking about Whitey Bulger. When you mentioned mob boss, FBI informant, this one isn't about Whitey Bulger. This is actually about a fellow named Greg Scarpa. And our guest today, Jonathan Dyer, wrote a great book. The book is called Greg Scarpa, Legendary Evil, The Many Faces of a Mafia Killer. And we go through the life of Greg Scarpa with author Jonathan Dyer in this conversation, and it's really fascinating. All right, everyone, please follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. We're going to take a quick break for commercial right here, and we'll be right back with Jonathan Dyer.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome to the podcast, Jonathan Dyer. Jonathan, how are you today?
I'm doing fine, Tim. How are you?
We're doing great. We're very happy to have you on the show. We were contacted by, I think, the publicist of your new book, and they wanted to make sure that they covered all grounds when it came to promoting this book, and we're happy to promote it because it's amazing. But before we get into this, can you introduce yourself to the listeners and maybe give a little background on who you are, what brings you to the show?
Sure, Lance. I joined the Army in 1981. I was pretty young back then, and after spending a couple of years training as a Russian linguist and then moving on to some cryptological training and then training at the National Security Agency, I was sent over to Berlin. And of course, the wall was still up back then. And I worked for 3 years as a Russian linguist during the Cold War in Berlin. My honorable discharge in 86, I entered law school. After law school, I practiced law for about 10 years. And then I decided to switch careers and became a teacher, and I taught government and U.S. history and criminal law, and did that for about 20 plus years, and then retired during the pandemic. Started writing about 30 years ago, and a couple of years ago, my writing partner suggested I write this biography, and at first I kind of pushed back and said, "Nah, that's not really me." But he kept nudging. And eventually I relented and spent a couple of years researching and writing, and that's where we are.
Well said. Very, very well said. But I got to back up a little bit. You were a Russian linguist in the Cold War?
Yeah, I studied Russian at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, enlisted, and became a Russian linguist because they were offering a really nice bonus for becoming a Russian linguist. So that was my motivation. And that was what I did in Berlin. I was keeping tabs on the Soviet Army.
Wow. How long did it take you to be so fluent in Russian to be able to keep tabs on the Soviet Army?
I spent a year in what was called the basic course. And then, it's going to sound like I'm bragging, but if you do well, you can take an extra 6 months. So I had a year and a half of language training. And the last 6 months was a bit like being in high school in Russia, studying lots of different subjects in Russian, some Russian literature, Russian geography, history. So about a year and a half altogether with language training. And then the military training took place after that at Goodfellow Air Force Base and then at Fort Meade at the National Security Agency. So kind of putting it all together there.
I thought you were just going to say you had a good streak going on Duolingo.
Yeah, unfortunately, either way, it's a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, so then you moved into your retirement years, and you have written this biography of a truly monstrous human being.
Yeah.
This is having to do with the mafia. Was that something that was on your radar, or you said you kind of needed to be talked into this?
Like I said, I've got this writing partner, and we've worked on a number of projects over the years, and he's had some focus on the mafia and organized crime. He's done a podcast, and we were working on a story about one of Greg Scarpa's lieutenants, a guy named Larry Mazza. And as a result of that, my partner, Joe Paletto, my writing partner, suggested I do the Scarpa biography. And so instead of being sort of a peripheral but very important character in the Larry Mazza story, just focusing on him. And so that's how I came about this. I'd never heard of Greg Scarpa before.
What about him made you interested?
Well, just about everything. As you guys know, I mean, he was not only a mafia big earner and also a mafia big killer. He was an FBI informant for 25 out of 30 years. And that just pops right out. And it's the sort of thing that he was able to get away with. And the people closest to him, some of them had suspicions about it, but didn't really know for sure until he finally pleaded guilty to some murders in open court and federal court. And during that pleading said, I tried to help, Your Honor. And that was his way of expressing it. And it came out at that point, and it was a shock to a lot of people that were very close to him. So an amazing story.
Can we go back to Scarpa's early life?
Oh, absolutely. He got out of high school at about the same time that millions of servicemen were coming out of the military at the end of the Second World War. He spent a short time in the Merchant Marine and then returned to his neighborhood in Brooklyn. Soon found himself working closely with a guy named Charlie the Sidge. By his association with Charlie, he ended up becoming a member of the Profaci family in the early 1950s. And the Profaci family was the predecessor to the Colombo family. By 1962, when Joe Profaci died, Scarpa had been working for about 10 years in the mafia and had, at least he self-reported to the FBI that he was a capo by then, which is kind of mafia middle management.
What was he like growing up? Was he always kind of like a tough kid?
Well, in his neighborhood, probably just about everybody was a tough kid. He grew up very poor. And I've got a couple of documents from the census takers talking about that show the amount of income that his mother and father had, and it's just negligible, both in 1930 and 1940. And Scarpa used to tell his daughter, Linda Scarpa, about the times when he would go around collecting coal with his old man when he was about 8 years old. And so I think he had a tough upbringing. There's nothing in anything that I found or anybody has talked about that there was subject to any abuse or anything. But, you had to be a tough kid in the neighborhood like that. Coming out of the high school when there was this demobilization going on, the job market was absolutely flooded with people. And so Scarpa did what a lot of young men did. They used the opportunity that was available to him, and that happened to be the Profaci family. Interestingly, well, I think it's all interesting, but anyway, interestingly, he's not Sicilian, and the Profaci family was the only one of the 5 New York families that would admit non-Sicilians. The other 4 families didn't trust people that weren't Sicilian.
That is so wild.
What type of Italian was he?
His father was from an area in northeastern Italy. His mother was from generally the same area, and that's covered in the early part of the book. And I got that information from the manifests of the ships that they sailed on in order to get to the United States right around the time of the First World War.
Now, for those crime families, what's the difference between someone who was from Italy and someone who was specifically from Sicily?
Yeah, Sicily has this long history of sort of notorious organized crime. It's smaller. It's a smaller community. It's a big island, but the people on Sicily are fairly well known. Who's in charge, who's not in charge is fairly well known. And I think that that was, at least in their minds, and I can't really speak to how these guys felt specifically, but my assumption is they felt that was a certain cachet that someone had, that being from Sicily, who would already understand what the mafia was about, what the rules were, how they had to behave, what they were supposed to do.
Was Greg's family, like, how deep were they connected to any organized crime in Italy?
There's no indication that I saw that they were connected at all. Greg's brother, Sal Jr., was also a member of the Profaci and then the Colombo family. But as far as his mother and father go, there's nothing to indicate that they were connected to organized crime. And that makes some sense, given that they weren't from Sicily. Not that there wasn't organized crime elsewhere in Italy. They were part of this great Italian diaspora moving out of Italy And at one point, there were more Italians living in New York than any other city in the world except for Rome.
So how did he get involved in the Profaci crime family? How did those connections get made? And then what was he doing with them?
He hooked up with this guy named Charlie the Cicero, and I've heard it pronounced a couple different ways, while he was there in Brooklyn. And Charlie kind of took Greg under his wing. Not unusual, he was involved in a lot of petty stuff, theft, maybe some burglaries, running numbers, placing bets for people, loan sharking. So the early stages of just about any associate and then a member of the mafia are going to be involved in a wide variety of activities, and some may even include murder.
So at what point did Greg start to achieve some advancements in the mafia?
Yeah, it looks like the late 1950s, early 1960s. He went from member to capo. And the capo regime, capo, it's captain. The documents from the FBI indicate that by 1962, he self-reported to the FBI that he was a capo. And when Joe Profaci died in 62, Scarpa expected to be renamed as a capo. And apparently it's the family boss's prerogative who his capos are going to be. And there was a struggle for power after Profaci died. At first, it looked like this guy, Joe Magliocco, was going to be the new boss of what would have been the Magliocco family. Magliocco eventually withdrew his name because he was in poor health and died 6 months later. And eventually, Joe Colombo was made the head of the family. Scarpa was not renamed as one of Colombo's capos. But according to Scarpa's son, Gregory Scarpa Jr., Scarpa was one of a handful of men who were very close to Joe Colombo. Joe Colombo trusted these men implicitly. By virtue of that position, he actually had more power in the family than a capo would have, even though he was just a good fellow, a member, a soldier.
Was that intentional on the part of Colombo to put him in that position and keep him tight like that instead of giving him the capo position?
Yeah, I have to assume it was.
Yeah.
I haven't seen anything in particular on that, but I have to assume it was that Colombo trusted Scarpa, and which is crazy because Colombo and his son both ended up being arrested as a result of information that Scarpa provided the FBI. Scarpa's playing both sides of the fence at that time. And of course, the FBI was delighted to have a guy that was so close to the boss of the Colombo family working for them.
Just out of curiosity, who became the capo instead?
It wasn't like there was this one-for-one trade-off. Okay, this is a former capo, now you have his crew. Colombo named his own capos, and all that's, I don't have it memorized, Lance, but all that's in the FBI documents, and I think I've covered that in the book as well. And what Colombo was after, generally, without any specific names, was energizing the ranks of the capo in the family by making younger men capos than had been under Profaci. And it's one of the reasons that Scarpa thought that he would be named a capo, because he was about 34, 35 at the time, which is pretty young for that leadership position in the mafia, but it didn't work out that way.
When and why did he become an FBI informant?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? When about 1962, he was approached by the FBI. They were looking for his brother Sal, who had been involved, at least the FBI suspected, in a hijacking. So they approached Scarpa, Greg Scarpa, and said, "Can you help us find Sal?" And, Greg Scarpa had taken a blood oath to the mafia, and he said, "Can't help you, fellas." And by all accounts, it was a fairly polite exchange. He didn't use any F-bombs or threats or anything. And but the FBI asked him a couple more times, and Scarpa finally said, "Look, you guys have got to quit approaching me. People are going to see me talking to the FBI, and they're going to kill me." And so the FBI backed off. And then a couple months later, Scarpa made the decision that, and I think he made it for two reasons. Scarpa made the decision to contact the FBI and see what that relationship would look like.
Right, so he contacted the FBI.
Eventually, right. They made the first contact. He brushed them off, and then he got curious about it and decided, let me talk to these guys.
Why?
There are two reasons. One is Scarpa saw it as an income opportunity. And one of the very first things we see in the FBI files is Scarpa saying to the FBI, gee whiz, fellas, I'm a little short on cash. I'm thinking of retiring, which is absurd. You don't retire from the mafia except in a box, right? And he said, I'm thinking of retiring. I got some debts. $3,500 would go a long way to just clear all that up, and then I could really give you some good info. And the FBI fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. And this is about 1962 when $3,500 was not an insubstantial amount. That, and I think Scarpa also understood that if he entered into this relationship, it would be a get-out-of-jail-free card for him. And so protection and from incarceration and also money. And he turned out to be spectacularly right on both counts.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Was there any other informant activity that was going on at the time that he might have been aware of? Because we're talking about 1962. We all are here in the, living in the context of 2025, where communication is so fast and easy now. But in 1962, how did he even, figure out how to do that? I guess I'm just talking about, he couldn't just Google, how to become an FBI informant. They contacted him first, yes, but was there any other frame of reference?
Not really, and that actually worked in his favor. During the 1950s, J. Edgar Hoover was denying that there was such a thing as organized crime in the United States, and he just said there's no such thing. And then, of course, Kennedy became president, and I found a speech from Kennedy from the campaign trail where he specifically mentioned organized crime as a threat and it's growing. And, of course, guys may be familiar with Bobby Kennedy, who really went after the mob, went after guys like Jimmy Hoffa, had a series of hearings. So they ramped things up quickly. But what is clear from the documents that even by 1962, the FBI knew precious little about the mafia. The description of Scarpa and his information time and time again during that early period is that it was singular. And they just weren't getting this information from anyone else. Scarpa was the shiny new object, and they loved it. Again, looking at the documents, he fed them everything. The organization of the mafia, the oaths of the mafia, the traditions of the mafia, what sort of things they were involved in. They just ate it up because they had nothing at that time.
So they got their money's worth.
Yeah, I guess so. But one of the things you got to remember is Scarpa was a master manipulator. He was feeding them information and also feeding them disinformation, trying to deflect attention from himself, trying to use the FBI as a way to maybe get at people that were his rivals in the mafia. Lance, I think that's a fair statement that they were getting their money's worth. They had no way of checking whether Scarpa's information was accurate or not. They couldn't, as Tim said, or maybe it was you, Lance, they couldn't say well, let's find out if Scarpa's telling the truth. Let's do a little co-pilot on the Scarpa document here. They just accepted what he had to say. And also, I think it's interesting that, and we see this language over and over again in the documents, that they felt Scarpa was stable and that he was being truthful with them all the way along. So he had them right where he wanted them.
Was he committing murders while he was an FBI informant, or did that happen before?
Yes and yes. And in fact, in 1975, he was dropped as an FBI informant. And the reporting that I'd seen on that until I started really digging in was that the FBI and Scarpa had kind of gotten bored with each other. He wasn't giving them anything more than mafia gossip. It wasn't very helpful. And Scarpa wasn't really enjoying the relationship anymore anyway. But what I think happened was, so this is 1975, another informant told the FBI that Scarpa had been involved in a murder back in 1964. And when Scarpa first became an informant, the FBI made it really clear to him that that was a line he couldn't cross. And so after that informant tells the FBI, look, I know of a murder that this guy was involved in as early as 1964, within a very short time, Scarpa is dropped as an informant. Certainly he was committing murder all the way along.
Okay, then let's talk about how vicious this Scarpa individual was. He had a couple of nicknames, the Grim Reaper, the Mad Hatter. None of these give me a sense of peace or tranquility. I don't believe you earned the nickname the Grim Reaper by doing good in your community. What were some of the examples of how he earned these nicknames?
In his office there at the Wimpy Boys Social Club, he called in a guy, Donnie Soma. There were a number of other men in the room. Scarpa had his office in the back of this club, which had been a gym, and that's why it was called Wimpy Boys, but it was kind of ironic once the Mafia moved in there. So anyway, he called Donnie Soma into his office, was doing some business. Soma was turning over some money that he'd collected. And then he asked Soma, "What's this I hear about you calling me a rat?" And Soma apparently right away turned white as a sheet, because if in the Mafia, the rules are if you accuse someone of being a rat and it's not true, it's your death. Soma started saying, "Oh, that was just, that was the beer or the whiskey talking, Greg. It was just me and some guys just popping off. And it wasn't anything to it." Scarpa said, "Do you have paperwork?" Which is another way of saying proof. "Do you have paperwork?" And Soma, again, kind of knew it was coming. And he said, "Oh, Greg, come on. It didn't mean anything. It was just me popping off a little." And Scarpa pulled out a .38 snub-nosed revolver and shot him point blank in his face. And then he walked around, and as Scarpa liked to say, he put one behind the ear to make sure the guy was dead. And this was in front of 4 or 5 other men. That was not atypical of the way Scarpa acted. His go-to solution was violence and often murder. I think probably the most heinous of the murders that he committed involved a former girlfriend of one of the members of the Persico family. And I go through that in the book about her murder and how his fellow mafioso said, "We're going to hell for this." And even in their view, it was an awful, awful thing.
Without giving away too much, can you expand on that a little bit? Like, what does it take for a Mafia member to say that they've gone too far and they're going to hell?
This was a young woman who had been dating this guy, Alphonse Persico, and Persico had gone on the lam, as they say. He was hiding out in Connecticut. Apparently there was like this Mafia underground railroad where you could hide out, they get you new documents, new identity. And the rumor was that his ex-girlfriend, who was about half his age when they met, he was in his early 30s and she was about 16, that she was going to talk to law enforcement and give away his location. That was one of the things that has been bandied about as the rationale for this murder. She was told, "Hey, come down to the club. We've got a job for you." They knew she was hurting because they'd cut her off financially. And so she went down thinking she was going to get jobs like a cocktail waitress. And Scarpa's son, after some pleasantries, jumped her, pinned her down, and Scarpa shot her. And she was so badly disfigured that they had to identify her by a tattoo. And she had a tattoo of a peach, which had been her nickname from her boyfriend, Mr. Persico. Yeah, that's what another member of the Mafia said, "We're going to hell for this one." And Scarpa even said that he gets these sorts of jobs to do because a lot of guys just don't have the stomach for it. And apparently he did.
I'm curious, the person who he shot in the face, who he said called him a rat, did that person actually call him a rat? And what did he mean when he said, "Do you have the paperwork?" I know that means you have the proof, but is it paperwork? Do you have the paperwork on me being a rat, or paperwork of you saying you didn't do that?
No, he was saying, "Do you have proof of me being a rat?" When he asked,
okay, gotcha.
Have the paperwork. I think it's probably the case that Soma was popping off at some point, but there were a few people that suspected Scarpa long before he admitted in open court that he was an informant. In fact, Carlo Gambino, the head of the Gambino family, in either 72 or 73, I can't recall which, told his crew and his members, "Stay away from Scarpa. He's got a big mouth." And he meant Scarpa was an informant. But no one could ever prove it. Or if they could prove it, they decided it wasn't worth the risk that Scarpa might take some action, hearing that he was trying to prove it. In fact, my view on the woman that was murdered that I just went through with you was that she was working for the FBI. And Scarpa found out that she was working for the FBI. Scarpa didn't care about this Persico guy, where he was. Scarpa had accused his brother through the FBI of murder on at least 8 different occasions. So this idea that Scarpa would want to make sure that his brother didn't get caught by the U.S. Marshals, to me, is ludicrous. I think it's much more plausible that he either suspected or knew that she was had a relationship with the FBI. And that relationship was later confirmed by a member of the U.S. Marshals who wanted to talk to her about Persico's whereabouts. And the FBI said, "We'd rather you didn't. We have a relationship with her."
Now, how many murders did he commit?
Tim, I think it's impossible to say. And this is one of the points I make in the book. These guys, it's not like Taylor Swift, who has a bunch of media following Scarpa around and saying, "Hey, what a great guy. He did 2 more murders today." And that, it's not like Major League Baseball, Aaron Judge had X number of home runs. And he's operating in a society that is secretive, and they're also pathological liars. We know pretty well how many murders he committed in the 1980s and into the 1990s. Before that, it's kind of sketchy. He told the woman who became his mistress in the early 1960s that he'd already been involved in more than 20 murders. So I think the number is somewhere between 20 and 50, but it's a guess, but it's a research guess, I guess.
What about his family life? He was a family man, right?
Yeah. Yeah. He was, a couple times over. He married Connie Forrest. That was his first wife, and they had 4 children together. And then he and Connie separated. He bought her a house, a horse farm actually in New Jersey. She ended up living there. At that time, he was already in a long-term relationship with Linda Shiro, who was his mistress for about 30 years until his death in 94. And while he was having this relationship with his mistress, and when he was still married to Connie, he married another woman, Lily DeJani, who was a woman he met at a meeting about getting rid of some diamonds. They didn't stay married very long, but he was legally a bigamist at the time and living with a third woman. And there were rumors about another woman who was pregnant with Scarpa's child around the same time, but I wasn't able to track that down with any specificity. He was a family guy a couple times over.
That's incredible that he can have that many relationships going on simultaneously-ish and have so many children out there. Was he earning really well? Was he making a lot of money?
Yeah, absolutely. He was, and he had a reputation as a big earner. It's not really clear exactly how much he earned because, they don't give you a receipt when you steal a duffel bag full of jewelry. He was indeed a big earner, and he worked with a crew that were very good at bank burglaries. And some of these burglaries of banks in the New York area ran into multi-millions of dollars. And of course, he had to share that money with people up the chain and people that worked for him. But there was a rumor that when he died, there were $20 million in cash in the walls of his house. And that turned out not to be true. But he also, he had an apartment in Florida. He had 2 children by his mistress, Linda Shiro. So at least 6 altogether that he was supporting. And he had a lot of nice stuff, a new car every year, lots of jewelry. He was a big earner, and that's how he afforded all that.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
And the FBI was still paying him during this time, right?
Yeah, except for that one little gap between 75 and 80 when he didn't have a handler. As I point out in the book, the record indicates that he was paid about $158,000 for his information from the FBI. And over 25 years, that's not a lot of money. His first handler, Anthony Villano, pointed out that another way that Scarpa would make money was they do these heists, and instead of the insurance company having to pay you back 100% on the claim, Scarpa would work through the FBI to the insurance company and say, well, why don't you just pay me 20% and I'll give you all of the merchandise back or most of the merchandise back. And the insurance companies were more than happy to do that. If Villano is correct about that, and I sort of extrapolated in my book, that was probably worth an additional $600,000 over time. So just on those alone, and that doesn't include all the other thefts, all the other hijackings, all the other loan sharking, all the other numbers collection, gambling, all that other stuff. That alone was about $750,000.
It's remarkable to me that he was able to have the fortitude to work with the insurance company and the FBI at the same time. That just sounds like a mess of red tape and bureaucracy. And then he works out the deal for himself. I mean, I feel like I'm in the wrong business here.
Well, Lance, the point is there wasn't any red tape. It was just, drop the stuff off at the loading dock and there will be either a check or a sack of money for you. That was the extent of the red tape.
But what about like the IRS? Was the FBI protecting him from the IRS too?
The IRS had their own focus. It wasn't until later that prosecutors and law enforcement started thinking about what are some other ways we can get at these guys. Now, the IRS famously was able to come after Al Capone for failure to report. These guys had a couple sets of books. They called themselves things like importers. They imported other people's stuff and exported it to people who paid less than they should have for it. But they had a couple of sets of books, and this lifestyle was almost an epidemic in New York by the 1970s. And there's a lot of good chronicling of how vast the influence of these guys was during the time. And it wasn't just because they were bad guys and had everybody scared, but it was also because of their contacts in various levels of government. Now, I don't have anything specific that I found that Scarpa was able to bribe an IRS agent or anything like that. But it's certainly a fair question about how he was able to do this. One of the guys that he ordered his son to murder was apparently threatening to get the IRS involved and looking at Greg Scarpa a little more closely. And, it could be the IRS, when they heard about that and they heard about this guy getting murdered, just thought, we've got safer fish to fry.
Can you take us up to his arrest and also his death? Right before his death, he had some really interesting things happen to him.
He finally gets arrested at the end of what's called the Third Colombo War. He was, at that point, suffering from AIDS. He was HIV positive starting in 1986 as a result of a blood transfusion. And then the Third Colombo War in the early 90s, and towards the end of it, he was definitely suffering from AIDS. At first, when he was arrested and charged with a variety of crimes, he was released with an ankle bracelet on his own recognizance. They thought, this guy won't be alive very long. His T-cell count's off. He's going to be dead pretty soon. So let's just send him home with an ankle bracelet. And while he was at home with an ankle bracelet, he got in a shootout with some drug dealers who apparently had offended his son. In that shootout, he had his eye put out. Yeah, he lost his eye. And he told Linda Shiro, you can just call me One-Eyed Greggy after this. And apparently, he's HIV positive and he's bleeding all over the kitchen floor with his eye put out, and he's throwing back a couple of belts of scotch. Eventually, they had to get him to the hospital. They just lost his eye in a gunfight. So when they went to the hospital, shortly after that, he was incarcerated and remained incarcerated in various institutions until he died in 1984.
You mentioned Greg Jr. a little bit and how he worked with his son. What was he like with his other children?
Well, he was, and this is one of the things about the many faces of Greg Scarpa, which is, the subtitle of the book. He was actually a pretty demanding father, not in the sense that he was necessarily abusive, but he wanted his kids to go to school, insisted on 100% attendance. He tried to do certain things as a dad, teach him sports, teach him this and that at home. Greg was the oldest son, and I think Greg never really had a chance. I think his dad saw him as somebody who was going to be in the life, as they called it, a good fellow. And when Greg was 16, he got in a fight in high school with a guy, and he came home and he had a pretty good-sized lump on his head. Greg Jr. was good with his hands. He was a Golden Glove boxer for a while, and he was a tough kid. So his dad said, what happened? And so Greg told him, and he said, well, I want you to go back there and I want you to beat that kid until he goes in the hospital. And Greg was saying, look, Dad, it's no big deal. He got in a fair lick. The police broke it up. It's all over. No big deal. And he said, no, you go back there, you put him in the hospital or don't come home. And Greg did. He put the kid in the hospital and of course he got expelled. And that was probably the trajectory that Greg Jr. was already on, but that made it a certainty.
I mean, that sounds just like good parenting to me. I don't know.
Parent connect, right?
Yeah. I mean, you don't want your kid to just lay down for anybody.
Yeah, well, you and I might not agree on that.
Well, everyone's got a different parenting style, so that's totally fair. Can you tell us about this blood oath that he took? Is that like a figurative thing or a literal thing? And was that prevalent in all these families?
Yeah, it's both literal, and they pricked some blood and exchanged some blood. There's not a lot of blood. But it's also figurative, and the idea is that you're part of this family now. And your main loyalty is to this family, and we're joined by blood, and that any violation of that loyalty could result in your death. And they swear to that, and there's a ceremony involved. That's fairly typical for the Mafia family, and I think that's probably one of the things they brought with them from Sicily, although I'm guessing.
When I was looking into Greg Scarpa, I happened to come across a couple of articles about a movie that's being made, and Mark Wahlberg is playing him. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, Mark Wahlberg is playing Scarpa, and the focus of it is as I understand, the 1966 trip that he made to Mississippi to help solve the Vernon Dahmer murder during the Civil Rights era, which is another. Tim asked me earlier, I think it was Tim, what did you find interesting about this guy? It's like, okay, now he's down in Mississippi helping the federal government solve, at least in my view, two of the biggest civil rights cases of the 1960s. And this is remarkable.
Yeah. How did that even become a thing on his radar? How did he become the guy to go down there? Like, why are they looking at this guy to go help out in the South?
Yeah, the best I can figure is that in 1964, when the 3 civil rights workers went missing down in Mississippi, the guys that were down there trying to register African Americans to vote, the federal government and Lyndon Johnson and the Department of Justice were under an enormous amount of pressure to at least find the bodies of these guys, if not find where they were and figure out who was responsible. And they were getting nowhere. They're sending these FBI agents down to Mississippi, and the Klan isn't just saying like, oh gee, FBI guy, I guess I'll tell you the truth. So there were some things that Scarpa as a private citizen could do that an FBI agent just couldn't do. And by all accounts, that included what we call today enhanced interrogation. And I think it's reasonably certain that he was involved in both the civil rights workers case and the Vernon Dahmer case, but he was able to get the information as to where the bodies were buried in the civil rights case, and then he was able to extract a confession in the Vernon Dahmer case.
Was he getting paid to do this?
Yeah, he was. He definitely got paid for the service that he was rendering, and one of the documents very generically refers to a payment somewhere between $3,000 and I think $30,000, if I'm not mistaken, which again, if it's on the high end, that's an enormous amount of money for the early mid-1960s.
Now, how did he get that information?
Threats and torture.
Yeah, what kind? Like how, I'm just so I know next time me and Lance see each other.
Yeah. He on the Vernon Dahmer case, he threatened the guy with a pistol, apparently put the pistol in the guy's mouth. There's some language that some people have used saying Scarpa said, I'm going to blow your effing head off. But interestingly enough, Scarpa did not like to swear. He eschewed swearing. And but he may have, in that circumstance, decided, okay, this is appropriate. He threatened the guy with his life, and apparently the guy believed it. And according to what I've seen, there was an exchange back and forth between Scarpa and the guy that was the target of this, a guy named Lawrence Bird. And Scarpa went out of the shack where he was beating this guy and interrogating him and checked with the FBI. And the FBI said, nah, that's nonsense. Try again. So on the third time around, the guy finally cracked and gave him the information about who was involved in this attempted murder and then the death of Vernon Dahmer. So anyway, for the next time you see Lance, just keep that in mind.
Yeah, that'll be the good approach there. Yeah. Now, what about Scarpa's family? What's going on with his son?
Gregory Jr. spent 33 years in federal prison, and 4 of those he spent in solitude. And he also, while he was in prison, renounced the mafia, renounced that life that he had been involved in, expressed a great deal of remorse. And I think it's sincere. I don't think he was just saying it like, gee, I'm really sorry. Can I go now? It was sincere remorse. And he's out of prison now. He was sentenced to life, essentially life in prison, enough years that it would be his whole life. But he has cancer of the larynx, and he was given a compassionate release a few years back. So he's still alive, but he paid dearly for what he was involved in.
Did you have any communication with him while you were writing the book, or no?
Yeah. He and I talked over the phone, and I also sent him some questions to answer. Greg has also appeared on other podcasts, and there was a book about him. So there's a lot of information in there. Some of it's wrong. Some of it is overblown for dramatic purposes. But Greg and I spoke, and we also, like I said, we exchanged correspondence, answering some questions that I had for him. Of course, in retrospect, he'd never deny what he did, but my interactions with him are very pleasant. He's a nice guy. He's older now, and obviously wiser, a nice, honest guy. And here's a guy, it's almost like Rip Van Winkle. He gets out of prison 33 years later, and somebody says, well, give me your email address. It was all snail mail when Gregory went in. So anyway, I've had some contact with him.
Very cool. Yeah. This is a great book and clearly well researched. So great job on the book. Is there somewhere that you like to tell people to get it?
Sure. I mean, they can get it at Amazon, at Barnes & Noble. If they go to my publisher, Wild Blue Press, they can help them getting copies of the book. And I think it's generally available on a lot of bookseller websites. There aren't a lot of copies in the bricks and mortar bookstores. But the online, even I think they can order it from Walmart online. So lots of online opportunities. Yeah.
And what's next for you in this book writing career of yours?
When I started this book, I was about a third of the way into a Cold War spy novel that's part of a series that I've written. And I've written 6, and I was working on number 7. So I'm picking that back up, and it's going to take a little while to refresh it because I've had it set aside for about 3 years, but I think I'd like to finish that next. Whatever next interesting project comes along, I'll roll my sleeves up and get into it. Yeah.
If you ever want to dig into the sometimes terrifying, corrupt, scandalous, seedy world of podcasting, just shoot Tim and I an email, and we'll be your informants on that.
Yeah, you're my first contact. Absolutely.
We're cheap. We all just, $30,000 to $40,000 just a
month.
A month.
Wow, that's impressive.
We read your book and we're taking notes. We're like, we got to toughen up here.
I think we're officially capos now.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well,
yeah.
A word of caution. That doesn't always work out so great.
It's not as cool as the movies make it out to be.
Yeah, that's you bring something up there, Lance. You always hear about mafia hitmen, a hitman this, a hitman that, and in the mafia they refer to it as doing work. Once you're a good fellow, you're required to do it. If someone says, okay, you got to hit so and so, there are some guys that are better at it than others, and some guys that enjoy it more than others, and some guys that absolutely don't enjoy it, and sometimes those guys that don't enjoy it, okay, you're part of the cleanup crew. You're going to have to clean the brains out of the car. But if you're tasked with this, you have to do it. So this Mafia Hitman title is kind of a popular title, maybe even a Hollywood title, but because they're all really required to do the work, as I said.
I think I would just volunteer to be a cleanup guy.
All right, I'll do the hits. That's fine. Thank you so much for joining us, Jonathan. We really appreciate your time. Really interesting story and a great book.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Really my pleasure to be on here and to be able to talk about it. And if you have any other questions, let me know.